what do we mean by God? I know but this book, it's structured in such a way, How to Save the West. It sounds like a self-help book in some kind of way. But in fact, it's structured around some really profound questions. And it attempts to answer them in rather plain English. What does it mean? The thought that there is, I was in my own thinking about writing about this. I was thinking the word God, in a way, big G, God, itself is like one of those church words that you were talking about that's begun to, in some ways, because it instantly conjures up this man with a beard or whatever, has lost its capacity we've lost our capacity to even hear it or understand it. I'm in part of me sort of like godness. Might be, even though I do think it is human, in its humans can relate to God, but godness, something objectively true and good and loving beyond all of this, to which all of this is sort of in some way oriented. Is that what we mean?
It's actually, it's not quite what I mean, but let me maybe back up and say a little bit about why the book is the way that it is. And that will help, I think. What you've said does relate to why I've kind of approached the whole thing from the angle I've approached it. This book comes out of my experience with the podcast, Young Heretics. It comes out of the experience of launching this podcast, which by and large boiled down to, you're in media, you're writing stuff, you're building a career, you ought to have a podcast. What's my podcast going to be about? Everybody's got one, And I thought, well, if I'm going to do one of these things, I'm going to just do it about the stuff that really lights me on fire. The stuff, and it's not going to be, there's not going to be any news hooks in it. It's not going to be like 10 reasons why Joe Biden is wrong about Aristotle. Like, it's going to be like just every week an introduction to the canon, because I feel powerfully that the canon is not a sort of gatekeeping device, but actually a collection of insights into what it means to be human and how to be good at being human. And the urgency of that was really apparent to me in my own life. And I thought, all right, anybody that wants to join me just talking through these great texts, I'm going to talk about them for an hour every week. My assumption about that was that it was going to generate exactly 0 listeners. I thought, well, nobody wants to talk about this stuff. This is all outre and it, doesn't play as well as politics. Instead, I met with this enormous hunger, with this just like, it was like holding out this little morsel of food, and then your arm almost gets bitten off because people are so ready for something of substance. And that didn't always have to do with theology. I mean, my understanding of the West, my take on the West is as the tradition and the inheritance of Athens and Jerusalem. And so the show deals with Greek pagan philosophers and Roman philosophers and so forth, and also deals with Jewish and Christian scripture and teaching. And what I realized from that is that although many people now are kind of wandering, I mean, talk about a generational difference. I think this is something that has really become more and more intense with each new generation. People are unmoored. They don't actually have a grounding in the canon. Our education system in this country does not do them any favors in the way that it sort of leads them into the literary tradition. And that kind of disconnection from tradition and from the canon was presented as an act of liberation, but actually was a disservice, a terrible disservice to people, and left them forlorn and sort of orphaned from what could have been, the riches of their inheritance. And so the podcast, and then ultimately the book, is really simply designed to say, in plain English, as you indicate, here's your kind of day-to-day concerns. Here's the stuff you're mad about online. Under the surface of this, there are actually really, as you say, first-order profound questions at stake that have been revitalized by the internet, by the way that technology sort of disorients us from ourselves and from one another. And in that process, you, whether you know it or not, are kind of smack up against first-order, crisis-level, profound questions. And the resources for answering those questions are available to you. They're just not in the places you've been taught to look for answers. They're not in science, they're not in technology, and they're not on the nightly news. They're in Aristotle, they're in the Bible, they're in this tradition, they're in Aquinas. And so it was actually in the process of writing that I realized kind of where, step by step, where that journey might go for somebody who was just getting started on it, who was just embarking on those questions. And so the book begins with, questions of absolute truth, questions of how can I know anything, what's there, and ultimately ends up with, well, for any of this to make any sense, there has to be a kind of what a philosopher might call a ground of being. And to do that, I did kind of set aside my doctrinal or denominational commitments. In other words, I say at some point in the book, I think it would be a better world if everybody tomorrow agreed that every word of the Nicene Creed is true. I think that. I think you should think that. It would be great if you did. But we're not there yet. As a culture, it seems like we've kind of traveled even further from the sources of ancestral wisdom, such that what we're really talking about is something closer to what's the bare minimum for even just language to hold together and the world to make sense. And it turns out that if you sit and think about those things, you do kind of end up coming face to face with, if not a human God, at least a personal God, right? With something that is conscious, that cares for you, that has an investment in the created world. And if you want to follow me further into the virgin birth and the incarnation, so much the better. But you're right, the book is not really about that. The book is kind of a first step in that direction.
It's also kind of telling people, you already believe some of this, you just don't realize it. And in fact, some of your intuitions, which you've learned to gainsay, you should relearn because they may be more truthful than some of the stuff you're being told through postmodern relativist discourse.